Shall we make a start? Welcome to tonight's Manchester Salon, which is on the legacy of Freud, and asking the question of whether childhood is beginning to dominate adulthood. Now, I've chaired many of these sessions in the past, and none of them have sold out. So you're obviously not here to hear me. So I'll keep my introduction brief, and then we'll let the speakers do their bit. But one of the reasons we wanted to look at this is because Freud's theories around repression, the unconscious, childhood abuse, seem to have permeated society to a certain extent. Even within the recovered memory debate of the 1980s, if you go into the last 10, 15 years, we've even had instances of people like Pete Townsend of the rock group The Who, when he got found to have downloaded images of child pornography. He blamed it on the fact that he was abused as a child. He couldn't remember being abused, but he was quite sure that he was. So these theories seem to have permeated society. But what we want to question maybe is whether, is it Freud's legacy? Is it Freud's words? Is it the way they have been interpreted in the contemporary climate and contemporary political situation? So hopefully we'll interrogate some of those today. We have two highly esteemed speakers for you. I'll introduce them in the order they're going to speak. First is James Heartfield. James is a writer and lecturer based in London. He has written sort of widely around a variety of subjects. His most recent books are An Unpatriotic History of the Second World War and the European Union and the Death of Politics. Perhaps more pertinent to tonight's talk is his 2002 book, The Death of the Subject Explained, which sought to chart why there was such a focus on the irrationality of the subject today. We really did not view the individual subject as being capable of very much with it. So that's James. And next to speak will be Ian Parker. Ian was Professor of Psychology at University of Manchester. At the moment, it was previously at Manchester Metropolitan University. He's written too many books for me to mention. He's the editor of the Annual Review of Critical Psychology. He's a member of Asylum magazine, and he's also a practicing psychoanalyst. And his latest book of a long line is Lacanian Psychoanalysis, Revolutions in Subjectivity. And he's also had the dubious pleasure of being my PhD supervisor, and he managed to survive that. So they're going to speak for approximately 12 to 14 minutes each, and then we'll throw it open for a discussion. Okay, so over to James.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Ken, and Ian and everybody who's made this work tonight. Years and years ago, my dad was a precocious student at the Andrew Marvell Grammar School in Hull, and he scandalised the sixth form common room by giving a talk, as he was invited to do by his indulgent conservative master, and looking for the thing that would be the most shocking and outrageous. He alighted on psychoanalysis, what was then thought of in Hull anyway, it's very new science, so he proceeded to tell his classmates about the Oedipus complex, how they all wanted to have sex with their mothers, which you could have heard a pin drop. And being an autodidact, he'd got the bull by the horns, and he was doing it for all his worth. And after he'd finished, the indulgent, somewhat Tory master, but essentially loved the boy, came up to him and said, that's so good, David, that was really exciting. He said, but I must tell you, the man's name is Freud, not Frood. And I suppose that's us, isn't it? We've read it, and but we're not familiar. I come kind of with the idea that we should. I'd like to big up Freud, but that's a bit eccentric. I know that, because what you're really saying is it's a bit like saying Chuck Berry is really great. because you know Chuck Berry's kind of important. But when you listen to it now, it seems a bit hokey, doesn't it? And he's probably a bit of a pervert. And you're most likely to find it on your grandfather's shelves, aren't you? So it's not essentially attractive. Freud's reputation has soared and fallen over the years. There was always a degree of resistance to Freud's ideas in Britain because this is the country of sceptical analytical philosophy, and the very idea of an unconscious provoked our native thinkers, because the idea that there was something that you couldn't put your finger on that was nonetheless determinate was shocking to them. The idea that there was something you couldn't see was against all the canons of dull Philistine English analytical philosophy. You know, things had names and they were real and you could test them, they were verifiable. But the unconscious was very difficult to get a handle on. And the terminology, it seems so strange. Well, not so strange, I mean, it was attractive. You know, when we were told ego and id, it appealed. You know, we had some categories to play with. And then the superego was introduced, and it felt a bit like that bit when you read in the Quran about Muhammad being flown to Mecca on a winged horse. That maybe it's a bit of an abstruse plot device. It's a bit too much, this superego and ego, and maybe these categories are somewhat fake and phony and put together, not very convincing. Of course, you know, people have pointed out since that they're wonders of translation, you know, and Freud's own terminology is much more straightforward. He was writing in German. And to him, it was what would you say in English? It would be the I and the it, the das Ich and das Es. But they become transmogrified by Ernest Jones or James Strachey, or you know, one of these translators had transferred them into Latin, ego and id, and they became categories that we should be attracted to for that reason. And again, we feel a degree of scepticism, because once you've mastered the categories, you begin to think, well, is it really true? It seems a bit of a grand construction. He was criticised later. You know, there was a falling out as other people coming in the world that he was in became more sceptical, and you know, Ronnie Lang and others were sceptical about the intellectual framework that they'd received from the past. They felt, with some truth, that there was something about Freud's own judgments that was somewhat tied to his time, that he was a bit of a patrician old man, and that his views that the proper order of society was that you know, fathers led families, and that families created persons out of the raw material, that this was a somewhat conservative view and was insensitive and indifferent to the traumas and tragedies within family life, and that, which I think is right, by the way, that Freud's own view of the family is a little conservative. You know, he took as a model what he grew up with in Vienna, and he thought that was kind of right and you know, difficult, but essentially working, a functioning thing. Functioning would really be the way you would say it. So you know, over time there came to be a greater degree of scepticism. Probably the most profound, though, of course, was the terrible attack made on Freud's reputation by Geoffrey Masson, and also with the support of Catherine McKinnon. Masson was an extraordinary and eccentric, but you know, fantastic guy in many ways, a genius and a crazed person in equal measure. He'd already become a champion of Sanskrit, but then later he decided to retrain, become a psychoanalyst, and he got a job in the Freud archives. That's to say, with Anna Freud, and this was the real damage that Masson did was that he said this terrible thing. He said, look, he said, he didn't say it that way, he said, look, this is shocking. He said, look, here at the very heart of Freud's theory is a lie. At the heart of Freud's theory is a lie. What's the lie, Geoffrey? The lie is that young women came to Freud and told stories of their sexual abuse. And Freud heard them and even wrote in his very first paper that he was surprised at the prevalence of incest in the family, that how many people had reported to him actual abuse. Abuse wouldn't be, of course, be the words that they would have used, but it was that's how we would describe it now. And Masson said that Freud knew that, and then later hid the truth. And he said what Freud did was he heard these young women tell these stories, and then he decided that it cannot be true. He decided, because he was a conservative in his moral outlook, that it cannot be true, and therefore something else was going on. Something else was going on. And what Freud decided was that what the women were reporting was not actual events of seduction, but their own feelings, the formation of their character within the family, which had an erotic component. And this was shocking charge to make against Freud, or shocking that Freud would deny this fact. I think it's our greatest challenge in a way. It's because I would like to defend Freud even on this, because it struck me that Masson's charges are particularly interesting because they get right to the core of the question of what it was that Freud had to say that was so unique. And what Freud had to say that was so unique was that the unconscious is not the same as an actual event. And that was really important, because what he was saying was that these women are not lying. That was Masson's misunderstanding. He said they're not lying. They're describing things as they felt them to be. But I am, and this is where I think he departs from contemporary trends, and certainly from Masson's idea, but I am interpreting. I will interpret, because what I feel that I can see is not the ubiquity of sexual abuse in the family, but the ubiquity of the incest taboo. What he's saying is that what the women reported in their prolonged discussions were feelings that they represented as events, feelings of being abused, of being seduced was the terminology he used. Raped, you may say, in some of the descriptions, but Freud insists that this is not actual instances, this is not evidence of events that took place in what we might call the ordinary world of events, but of a psychology, of an unconscious. And this is the terrible thing, because in insisting that Freud was a liar, which Masson did, he played on a great fear that we have, the fear that Freud was a man who hid child abuse. And it was a powerful thing to say. But in the very process of doing that, he's challenging the very thing that's unique about Freud's insight. It's unique, is the deductive, not inductive, the deductive science of saying there is an unconscious. There are movements within us, there are motives within us which are not yet conscious. They're before the conscious, that we're yet to give expression to. And it's for that reason that Freud's reputation, I think, probably today is hardest to defend. Because first, it has a big, powerful headline, he disguised abuse. But more importantly, it's hard to defend because the very thing that is most dramatic, it strikes me, and most valuable in the science, and there are many things that I think you might want to say, well, you know, I'm not sure that that's entirely true. But to insist that there is a psyche, that there is an unconscious, that there is a realm to be discovered and interpreted and that this is open to scientific interpretation. Strikes me as the most valuable.
Okay, thank you, James.
Okay, thanks, James. You put a lot of issues on the table there, and I hope that we'll be able to unpick them bit by bit when we have our discussion. First thing I should say is that because of these lights, and I'm not in such a bad position as James, we swapped seats earlier, but I can't see you, really. So it's rather like being in analysis. Now, in this question, the question that frames this discussion is childhood beginning to dominate adulthood, which James didn't talk about, but we'll come back to it later, I think. This question is childhood beginning to dominate adulthood, and what is the place of psychoanalysis in that? There are only two questions, and I want to say a little bit about the first of those questions first. Is childhood beginning to dominate adulthood? And I think when we look at that question, we have to understand that these categories, childhood and adulthood, that we're using as our concepts here, are historically constituted, have changed over time, and those two categories are split apart, reified, turned into separate things today. And they have a relation, always have a relation, these categories, with power. In the last 100, 200 years, those categories, childhood and adulthood, have had a relation with capitalism and the state. So we have to understand how childhood and adulthood are constituted in relation to capitalism and the state. And on the one hand, you could say, yes, that childhood is becoming a force that dominates adulthood. You can see it, for example, in the way that advertisers target children and mobilize children to recruit their parents into being good consumers. The advertisers know this. They call it pester power. If you can get at a kid and you can get them to want something, or you can get them to want their parents to have something, then you can get them to be a very powerful force in inciting the consumption of more and more commodities. So in that sense, yes, childhood dominates adulthood. There's another sense, of course, in which childhood dominates adulthood, we could say, which is in the infantilization of people. The way that people are treated as if they're children, treated as if they aren't able to make choices on their own, and invited to position themselves when they seek help as if they're victims, always dependent on others. And the trick is that when people start to speak with a position of power and authority and claim what is rightfully theirs, then the ideological trick is that they're not taken seriously, because the idea is that they've already got what they want, they've got the power to claim these things, so why should we give them these things? Only when they position themselves as victims are they taken seriously. But this is only one side of the equation, and it's a side of the equation which is emphasized in some of the work that appears in the Institute of Ideas and the Spiked online website. It mines that side of the equation very well. But there's another side of the equation which is also important, equally important, and you have to approach this question dialectically, look at the two sides of the question, and that is, today, adulthood dominates childhood even more than ever. You can see it dominating childhood, for example, in the sexualization of children, in the ways in which children are treated as if they're little adults and expected to have the same kinds of desires, the same kind of sexuality as adults. That's something that psychoanalysis always put in question, but that is an ideological assumption that is powerful today. And it's also there in the way that people are made in these times of neoliberal capitalism to be adult, self-sufficient individuals, as the National Health Service is being dismantled, people are told that they should take responsibility for their health and well-being and look after themselves. They should be adults. There's nothing childish about the neoliberal subject. For all of the emotional talk, the emotional literacy talk, the subject is constituted as an adult and set against any kind of dependence on others. So we have to look at the two sides of the equation. And that brings us to psychoanalysis. Because psychoanalysis as a practice, as Marxism was as well, and there were very close connections between psychoanalysis and Marxism in the early years of the development of psychoanalysis in the early 20th century. Psychoanalysis was a child of the Western Enlightenment, and it looked back to that idea and took seriously, very seriously, that idea that people should, in the terms outlined by Immanuel Kant in his essay, An Answer to the Question, What is Enlightenment? That individuals should have the courage to think for themselves. And that's exactly what psychoanalysis is concerned with. You find lots of images of psychoanalysis in the media, as if psychoanalysis is trying to turn people into needy little children, concerned with regression, trying to turn them back into children again. But psychoanalysis actually is a practice which is concerned with the privileging of adult rationality over childhood and inviting people to go into clinical treatment to think about what has happened to them from the standpoint of being an adult, not from the standpoint of being a child. I want to give you three examples from the three main traditions in psychoanalysis, just to drive this point home. The main tradition in psychoanalysis in the English-speaking world, which became dominant after the Second World War, especially powerful in the United States, but with some influence in Britain through the work of Anna Freud, Sigmund Freud's daughter, was called ego psychology. And the ego psychologists looked to one of the phrases in Sigmund Freud's later writings, an essay in 1933, in the new introductory lectures on psychoanalysis, where Freud says, the aim of psychoanalysis is, and he puts it this way, it's translated as, where id was, there ego shall be. Where id was, there ego shall be. And he carries on with a metaphor which links this developmental narrative with a narrative about the development of civilization. He says, it is the work of culture not unlike the draining of the Zuyderzee. It is very clear that the task of psychoanalysis is not to release the infantile id, but actually to increase the power of the ego, to drive back the forces of the id. There's some problems with that conception of psychoanalysis, but that was the dominant form of psychoanalysis in the English-speaking world. And it's in that tradition that you have, for example, the discussion of various defense mechanisms that people use to protect themselves, which categorize defense mechanisms that we use into immature defense mechanisms and mature defense mechanisms that should be supported and reinforced in the process of the analysis. And you see it, for example, in some of the worst aspects of the ego psychology tradition in France, in the work of Janine Chasguet-Smirgel, who uses this notion of ego psychology to attack anyone who would want to confuse adults and children, to confuse the generations, which she labels as being perversion. So it's a use of psychoanalysis which clearly privileges adulthood. The second tradition I want to talk about is the tradition which became dominant in Britain around the work of Melanie Klein. Melanie Klein still informs most British tradition psychoanalysts here. And for Melanie Klein, although Melanie Klein worked with children, and you might then assume that she wants to reduce us all to being children, Melanie Klein is very clear that the processes that she describes as happening inside the infant, problematic descriptions, but we come to that discussion perhaps, the processes that she describes, the paranoid schizoid position and the depressive position, are not developmental stages, but they are positions. They're positions that we move backwards and forwards between through our adult lives. And the task of psychoanalysis is to reinforce the more mature of those positions, the depressive position. So again, it's from the standpoint of an adult that the analysis is carried out. And when we look at regression in psychoanalysis, the idea that people should in some way get in contact with childhood feelings in the process of analysis, we have to notice, first of all, that this is contained in the psychoanalytic clinic. We're not encouraging people to run around outside and behave as if they're children. And crucially, it's a regression that is accompanied by reflection. That is the key thing of psychoanalysis. That as the infantile experiences and feelings emerge, we are reflecting on what is happening and noticing what we are saying about them. A very adult thing to do. Finally, in the third tradition of psychoanalysis, that which is dominant or most widespread in the world as a whole, which is my tradition of psychoanalysis, which follows the work of the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, not very powerful in the English-speaking world, but actually, if you look on a world scale, over half of the psychoanalysts in the world draw, to one extent or another, on the work of Jacques Lacan. It's very clear that Lacan is privileging adulthood in the way that he describes the progress of analysis, and, crucially, he retrieves from Freud a notion of time which is based on a retroactive effect. Freud calls it Nachträglichkeit in his early writings, a deferred action or a retroactive effect in which the experiences that we have as children are given meaning by things that happen to us later on. And that retroactive effect, that peculiar notion of time, which distinguishes psychoanalysis from any notion of psychology as it is taught in the universities here, that notion of time in psychoanalysis functions all through the analysis so that we're always understanding what happened from the standpoint of the present day. And when Lacanians work with the notion of regression, it's not regression to childhood feelings and emotions. It's not a regression to what Lacan rather scathingly called the affective smoochy-woochy, but it is a regression of the signifiers, that it is a regression to the terms that were used, the terms and phrases that become important to us in forming our identity, and which we're then able to hear ourselves speak as we engage in analysis. So psychoanalysis is not part of this trend of reducing things to childhood or allowing childhood to dominate adulthood. It is, if anything, the reverse. It's the opposite. And at the same time, psychoanalysis understands this relationship between childhood and adulthood dialectically, so it understands that even when we are adults, we, to some extent as human beings, are dependent on others, and that dependence on others gives us the opportunity to engage in collective action to empower ourselves as well as individual reflection.
Okay, thank you, Ian. Lots to think about there, and so we'll throw it open to the audience in a minute. I suppose if I could just ask a question to sort of get the flavour of it then. If we look at sort of the focus on childhood, is there any reason why we could say there is the focus today? Because, I mean, if you think even the left sort of views children don't they? It's a sort of to take away from adult responsibility. If you think about asylum seekers, you get things like end child detention. You know, what about adult detention? Isn't that a problem? End child poverty. Well, isn't poverty a problem? So there seems to be, in the whole political spectrum, there's this focus on children as a sort of negation of adults engaging with the world. I'm just sort of wondering if sort of where you see that coming into it. Why have we got to such a situation like that?
I remember being in Manchester, living here in Whalley Range in 1993, and around the time that Jamie Bulger was killed, and some of the people in this room organised a meeting to talk about it, and some of the changes that took place in the law at the time were really intriguing, because it was one of those events where people feel that something must be done. That was compelling, and that felt very sure about what they were doing. And they made something that, if they'd have ever looked to recognise it, as some of them did later on, they'd have been amazed. Because what they did was, Jack Straw polemised for, and then as later became the Home Secretary that made the change, is they effectively they reduced the age of responsibility. You know, they changed. We had this law. It was a bit peculiar. He made fun of the fact that it had a Latin name. It's called Doli in Capax, incapable of harm. I think not Latin scholar. And the point of the change in the law was to recognise that small people could do damage to yet smaller people or others, and to wake up and say, recognise in these that you call children responsible agents who must be punished for their bad acts, and in the clamour of the moment, these changes were made, and I can remember being unhappy and arguing about it and not really quite understanding it, but as it became clear, it seemed, I mean, there were consequences that nobody really expected. So it's part of why there is a large juvenile prison population today, is because of that change in the law. Because we'd made this odd confusion, presented this terrible event, that we looked at children and we saw them as if they were grown people capable of shouldering the burden of a judgment. And one of the psychologists that worked with the two children said, with tears in her eyes, she said that, and they were drawing pictures with crayons in the courtroom while they were being tried, because they didn't really know what was going on. No grown person, well, I suppose some grown person might be doing that in contempt or whatever, but it was a sign. And you think, well, how could you make that terrible mistake? How could you look at a child and see a man? How could you look at a juvenile and see a grown person who could understand what they were doing? And I think that it was at the other end the change was happening. It was because the political process, the social process, I don't know quite how to characterise it, but had been gradually eroding that sense in which we were expected to be, us adults, to be authors of our destiny. We'd been told again and again that we weren't really to be trusted with the local council, that instead the Urban Development Corporation would spend the money, that we weren't to be trusted with the levers of government, that we were a bit too stupid for that experts would have to take our place. And we'd lost gradually over time the sense of ourselves as authors, as agents. And it was in that context that we could then look at the kids and say, oh yeah, well, maybe they're grown-ups too, because it doesn't seem that different from us. It's the distinguishing line. I very much agree with him that it is a dialectical question. The diminution of the adult is also a confusion, a blurring of the line between the adult and the child. It's not to have a strong sense of the difference comes about because you don't have a strong sense of civil liberality. When they brought the law in, the Dole and Capats, it was because they were fed up with hanging kids for stealing sheep. It was a very practical thing. You could be hung in those days for stealing a sheep, but if you hung a child for stealing a chicken, even a medieval peasant could see there was something freakish going on. That was why they brought in the rule. But you see, that in a very primitive time, the sense of distinctness of adults is quite weak. The sense of, and you say, and I agree, that the historical invention of childhood was one of the books that was described. That people didn't have special clothes for children or time for children. There wasn't school time. This is a modern invention, and a glorious one, may I say, a glorious one to demarcate, to insist upon the room for development. I've got daughters of my own, and I want to keep the adult world away, as not insanely, but I don't want them to be rushed too quick headlong into that. It's a great achievement, and we're losing it. We're losing it over time, not really because children have changed that much, but because grown-ups have a less confident, less strong sense of the fact that they're in charge, and they're reluctant to tell the kids, don't do that. They're reluctant certainly to tell other people's kids, don't do that. That's big taboo these days, as anybody with kids knows. And they because they have a diminished sense of their own adulthood.
I mean, there's something particular about the way that children are seen as needy little beings that need protecting in Britain. I have to remember, for example, that the RSPCA, Royal Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, was founded in Britain before the NSPCC. And when the NSPCC, National Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Children, was founded, it used the statutes of the RSPCA as its basis. They shared the same building for a while in the 19th century, and then when the NSPCC started to make a claim for charity, there was a conflict opened up between the RSPCA and the NSPCC, and so you have a separate domain here which is constituted of these poor children who need to be protected, and indeed to some extent they do. And if anything, I think the lesson of the Jamie Bolger case is not so much that people are infantilized, that the children have their rights taken away from them, but they're treated as little adults. Isn't that the case? That it's the adulthood that starts to dominate and push out the domain of childhood, and it operates in a very contradictory way in relation to this question of the way in which people who are dependent or helpless are treated as if they're children. It's like they're pushed to the margins at the same time as they're infantilized and treated as not having any rights to speak within the general discussion and general political activities that we're engaged in. So it's a very complicated process here, and I think, if anything, from what you've said and the issues that have been raised, it points to a problem of adulthood rather than the problem of childhood coming to the fore here. And we need to think about that as a frame for these questions of where psychoanalysis goes.
Okay, I'll bring it out to the audience. Does anyone want to tell us about their childhood or their adulthood, or any questions, any comments? I'll take about 3, 4, maybe 5 at a time, and then I'll bring the speakers back. So, you there?
I want to talk about my own childhood particularly. I'm not a psychologist, I've never studied psychology, but I've read 1 or 2 books on personal development, and from what little I've read of Freud, I've often found it a little bit depressing, that it seems like shackles about childhood experiences. But whenever I've read books out at the same rate on personal development, Freud hardly gets a look in. But as far as I'm aware, two of his contemporaries, Adler and Jung, get a lot of serious mention on the basis that, as far as I can see, Adler and Jung seem to suggest that if you're prepared to sort of step forward in confidence and listen to good counsel, you can move forward. Whereas Freud then you probably correct me, that seemed to suggest, tough mate, you can try and be basically shackled for how you were, brought up or whatever. And I mean, rather than treating children as adults, again I get the impression that, I mean, for example, when I was a kid, you know, if you were sort of I don't know, very egotistic, wanting attention, you're seen as self-centred. Whereas now that's excused because you've got attention deficit disorder. And it seems there's so many excuses now that whereas in past times, I'm not suggesting you should be hanging kids for stealing sheep, but in so much as most people, although they might differ on the definition, well, if I said to most people, you know, there's a difference in right and wrong, most people will probably say yes. And it seems that there's so many now excusing syndromes, that it makes me wonder how long will it be before the likes of the upper rib will be excused because of this syndrome or this syndrome. You see what I mean?
He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia actually not long after he was sentenced. Was someone next to you?
Hi, I'm a mother of 3 children, 3 boys. I'd just like to make the comment regarding childhood is seen as being an innocent time. But to me, this idea of children having this innocence also makes them desirable, perhaps along the lines of, you know, people want something that's innocent. So are we not endangering our children by sort of putting them out there as being this innocence of something that's, you know, not sexual, and they don't have these desires and they're not aware of what's occurring, you know, whereas I believe Freud, through translation, has been lost, and that was the idea of what he spoke about in the writings that he said, that we all, you know, it's all there within us, and to class children as innocent, are we making them desirable more and at risk?
Thank you. Anyone else?
I just referring back to my own childhood in a small town in the northeast of England. My memory of childhood is pretty much an adult-free experience, actually. And we had contact with adults, of course, in schools and occasionally at home, etc. But the adult world was very different to ours, and as children, there was quite a self-regulating and complex society, and that society was actually quite self-determining in its own way. It was powerfully cultural and self-determining, and so it seems to me that what happens is that somehow there's been a sort of adult liberal encroachment into childhood, a kind of a grasping hand that seems to sort of want to take a hold of childhood and in a way control it, I feel, and it seems to me that it happens at a multiple level of planes, really, in lots of ways. And so that's kind of what I wanted to say. It seems to me the darkness is coming from the adult world,
Okay.
powerfully into childhood.
Okay, thank you. Just in front of you, and then Simon at the back, and then I'll bring the speakers in.
I'm trying to get a sort of sense of what's, I think it's probably behind what both of you are saying, that we're seeing people as either children or as adults, and to what extent are we, in doing that, occupying some sort of ideological position, and to what extent are sort of adult and child consequence of particular ways of structuring self. But I'm trying to think in terms of how I conceptualise myself from my own inner experience. I can remember that as a child, I tried to imagine myself as an adult. I wasn't quite sure. I sort of teachers sort of saying things like, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And I sort of remember the whole primary years I wanted to be a press reporter. Unfortunately, I didn't go down that direction. But for me as an adult, I find it much harder to sort of think in terms of conceptualising myself as a child. because I've got various stories I tell about when I went to Butlins in 1964 as an 8-year-old. But the thing is, I've told that story so many times now, it's basically an adult version of that 8-year-old child. And I can go back to various parts of me, and there's this sort of sense of past versions of me that have been adultified. But to sort of, I just try to get a sense of how one can actually do the work, and I'm sure this is sort of central to a lot of psychoanalytical work. How can you do the work of getting back to seeing yourself as a child from a child's perspective? Like, is that something which is possible? Or is it always a case of the child being reclassified through particular adult perspectives?
Good question. Simon, then I'll bring this person.
Ian, I take your point about the importance of proper clinical psychoanalysis. But what we have in the modern world is a million miles from that, it seems to me, certainly in popular society. And to recount a discussion that I had this afternoon in therapy, I was on Facebook with Denny Joe, and we were talking about our childhood experiences and what it was like being at school. And I do remember, even at primary school, where my school teacher would give me money to go out to the shops over a main arterial A road and buy his lunch for him. And then similarly buy stuff from the hardware shop for other teachers. For anything like that to happen nowadays is completely unimaginable. The idea that kids should be allowed that degree of freedom or responsibility is completely and utterly unimaginable. Something's happened, something very profound has happened, where adults in the adult world look at each other and look at them as potential abusers. And that same scenario nowadays, I'm sure, would be a story about being groomed, ready for some awful situation. Now you cite neoliberal, conservative politics for being responsible for transforming the way that adults are seen, or the way that adults see children. But I don't really get that, because that surely happened a lot earlier, politically and socially. And James highlights the Jamie Bulger case. So a lot of these developments have happened a lot earlier. So what is it? It's not an elite that have sat up there and decided to politically change the balance. Something far more profound and socially widespread has happened, and it's happened at a much earlier kind of time frame. So could you just elaborate a little bit more in the way that therapy has become popularised and thoroughly degraded outside of proper clinical therapy?
Okay. So I'll bring them in. Just summarise, so hopefully I'll summarise these actually. Why Adler and Jung and not Freud? Isn't this promotion of childhood as a space of innocence problematic in making them desirable? Have adults colonised childhood in the sense that childhood used to be an adult-free space? Do we come from a specific ideological position when we look at this? Is meaning as much about the present as it is the past? I suppose I'd like to add to that then, couldn't that also mean, I think there is an element of truth in that, memory isn't like replaying a videotape, showing my age there, replaying a DVD. But can't you see that that could easily be used by those who would wish to deny the reality of child sexual abuse, for example? And the final question, in the psychoanalytic tradition, I suppose we've got very good therapists like yourself, but what's happening in society is a million miles away from that laudable tradition. Over to the two of you, whoever wants to. James?
Yeah, go on.
I mean, they're difficult questions, and there aren't simple answers to them. And I do agree that there is a big difference between the practice of psychoanalysis, the issue that Simon raised, and the way in which psychoanalysis is framed in the media, the way in which psychoanalysis is reduced to being some kind of therapy. But I think we have to take seriously that practice, because it's that practice that people meet when they come into psychoanalysis, when they actually find it for themselves. And for some people, it is a shock, it is a surprise to come into psychoanalysis and to discover that they're not going to be treated like a child, and that the aim of psychoanalysis is not to reduce them to a childish state. But in doing that work, in going into psychoanalysis, the first step that is taken is a very courageous step. It's a step in which you open yourself up to speak about things to someone that you don't know, to speak in such a way that you have never spoken before, to speak about things that you have never spoken about before in many cases, and to put pieces of the puzzle together so that you can make sense of them. And that's what I wanted to emphasize. And in terms of the popularization of psychoanalysis, it's not only an infantilization of people that comes through in the popularization of psychoanalysis. The different versions of psychoanalysis that I described, ego psychology, Melanie Klein, Jacques Lacan, are all forms of psychoanalysis that circulate in our culture and give models for us to be human beings and to think about ourselves. With respect to Adler and Jung, I leave Adler aside for a moment. There are very, very few Adlerians left in the world now. They're more a fantasy of psychology textbooks than anything else. There was a small group in London a few years ago, but they didn't get registration with the UKCP because they weren't doing analysis. They were simply giving people advice on how they should live their lives. It wasn't a therapy recognised by the registration bodies. And Jung, I just leave aside as not being psychoanalysis. Maybe we can come to that later. I've got a friend who used to teach in Manchester. When people used to ask him about Jung, he used to say that Jung made him feel sick, and of course the students immediately rushed to the library to read Jung as a result of that, so I won't make that mistake. I agree with the point about children being presented as innocent, and as being presented as something, a category of being that is desirable to us at a time in which the world seems to have been completely degraded and sexualized, and in which we search for something of human experience that isn't touched by that degradation and sexualization. And the category of the innocent child does function very neatly in that kind of way, ideologically, as that place into which we can put our hopes and fantasies of something that escapes the terrible things of the world. But it's something that Freud insisted on in the development of psychoanalysis, that we all of us have destructive and sexual feelings that we defend ourselves against, and we have always, all of us, had those destructive and sexual feelings that we learn to defend ourselves against. And the big puzzle with the story about Geoffrey Masson in the Freud archives is that Masson claims that Freud tried to pander to psychiatry in Vienna by covering up actual childhood sexual abuse and inventing psychoanalysis in order to become acceptable. The big puzzle is why he did it by inventing a theory in which he told his audiences that we all have sexual and destructive feelings, which was surely much more scandalous and enraged people even more. That is, if he intended to curry the favour of the audience, he certainly wasn't going in the right direction. Psychoanalysis is a scandal in Western culture, and it makes us think in a different way about the nature of the human being. Okay, there are other things that came up, and I haven't dealt with them. We'll return to them later on. I should pass over to James.
That was excellent, thank you. Yeah, on the the guy at the back started on the Jung and Adler and where is Freud, and I think with a lot of our answer here already is that Freud's influence, psychoanalysis's influence, is ubiquitous. It's and so much so, like so many things, that you forget and you don't notice it, and it becomes written into the culture. And I suspect, in a kind of cack-handed, nonsensical way, often, I don't mean that it's not interpreted in a good way, but often I think in a very cack-handed way, because there's something in the present makes us like the story that I have lost my job because of the terrible things that happened to me when I was young, or I've been mean to my wife again. I must have a destructive impulse that I can't restrain, and this is a kind of cod Freud, I think, that people often deal in, and novelists in particular. And I was just talking to a friend who's a keen student of literature, and we were both saying how depressing and boring it is at that point when you read the modern novel, when you realise that the motivating characteristic of the character is that they were abused in childhood. And the very thing that the author imagines is the thing that will make it stand up and become attention-seeking is actually kind of trite nonsense that really takes all the... I was just reading Ross Raisin's God's Own Country, and at the point when it slips into the abuse story, you think, oh, well, all the subtlety went out of your novel, and I've really upset Ken, because I'm not going to name the novel, but I did, and of course it's all about him being abused by his uncle, which Ken's face dropped and said, "You don't mean?" And I said, "Yes, I'm sorry, I do." I don't know if he's...
I'm halfway through it.
But I think this happens all the time, because I'm amazed that no literature student has done it yet. Wouldn't this be a great piece of work just to say what a weird modern late 20th century, early 21st century cliche this is, that the whole key to all motivations is and I was abused as a child. I don't think that is Freud's story. I think it's a misreading of Freud's story. I think it comes from roughly the same place. We're interested. We like the story of repression, I think, because it's kind of true. That there are the ways, as Ian described, the way we deal with the earlier urges, and we sublimate them in different ways. These are what ways our characters are formed. So we're attentive to it, but we like the story in its vulgar form because it's a shying away from self-authorship. It's a sense in which we feel a release from authority over our own lives. I was very interested in what Ian had to say about, I forget what it was called, about between Lacan and Freud, of that thing when you look back. What's the terminology? Nachtraglichkeit. Because I was going to change the names. I'm still going to change the names of the as an anecdote. I know these three sisters who are all obviously raised by the same family, and one sister is convinced that her father is emotionally and physically abusive and a terrible man. And it still confronts him on a regular basis, demanding apologies, writes letters to him, and he's an interesting character with lots of complexity himself. I can give a fair account. But the other two sisters don't share this view, and they remember a very different childhood. And each event they actually remember, but it's not their view. And in the case that both sisters are relatively successful, the sister I'm talking about is relatively unsuccessful. And it strikes me that it's compelling that her interpretation of her prehistory is on the morbid side, because her life is difficult, and she's not managed in different ways to cross the barriers that she could have done, and to her it looms larger, the restraints loom larger, whereas those other sisters who have made more successful lives, they see all the same events, but they just have less bite. And I would say that's was going to be my anecdote to describe. I know it's nonsensical, but our attitude to our past is a kind of we feel it overwhelm us when we are less confident, and we feel it containable when we are more confident. That's to say, in an ironic way, it's the present creates the past, not the past creates the present.
Okay. Throw back out to the audience. Tom, Dennis.
It was quite an interesting question that we had here, because Ian, you said that adulthood, you haven't seen adulthood dominate more than ever before. I'm not psychoanalyst, so I haven't had any experience in it. I've read a little bit, but my area one of the areas I was involved in was substance abuse. And it's a really interesting sort of area, because I'm sure this really frustrating. You have COD psychology going on all the time. What you have is sometimes you have professional intervention, or you get what I call dilettantes. And the whole aspect of it, or the whole idea behind it, is that your addiction, your alcoholism, is a result of your childhood. And to me, that is the thing that seems very popular. Any problem that comes up now is regress back to your childhood. And I think that's, that what's happening in society, you cannot say that it's adult dominating. I think it's a mixture of both. And I think that is an aspect of the fact that society in itself doesn't actually know where it's going. That there was this massive confusion. It has been going on for a long time. We've seen it in Christopher Ash noted this in the 70s sort of thing. And you have all kinds of lunatic psychoanalysis stuff like Milan Wright's Primal Scream, all this sort of stuff. But I think the whole idea of is that psychoanalysis and all the various forms is being used not consciously, but it's undermining responsibility. And I do think that there is this thing of like which you do see the sexualisation of children, which you have seen in the lowering of the age of responsibility after the with the Borgia trial. But you still see this dominant thing of that we need professional help sort of thing. As adults, we all need to be guided through our lives. And there is this sort of tie that everything that's wrong with you now is a result of what happened to you as a child. I do see that as the whole point, part of what has happened to the world in the past, probably since the end of the Second World War, actually. But I don't think you can actually say for definite that either is dominating. I think confused times that we live under is used as a very convenient excuse. We're always told that these are very confusing times. And one of the things is the idolisation of childhood, or innocence if you want, is actually, in one sense, you can look on as the idolisation, excuse me, the idolisation of ignorance, which is basically what children are, which is, they're ignorant for the simple reason is they haven't had the experience of the real world.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Just there.
One of the things I want to raise about adulthood dominating childhood is the concept of the useful child. So, for example, in the West, we're into nurturing and protecting our children, but in earlier times in the West, we sent our children to work in the factories and we weren't necessarily protecting them to that degree. And how that blends with children across the continents who are still useful children today, and how adults may dominate that situation as well.
Thank you. Anyone else? Dan?
Yeah. Could you argue that one of the distinction between childhood and adulthood is knowing what you want? So, for example, the child would say to the mum, I'm bored, and the mum would know why the child was bored and would say, well, go out and play. But the adult, with the experience of life, is able to know what they want. And so, to that extent, could you argue that sort of psychoanalysis and the proliferation of experts who try to explain people to themselves infantilises adulthood because it says that you don't know what you want? And the second question is, I'm struggling to understand the significance of your opening explanation of Freud and the unconscious, because you said that the present dominates the past. So were you arguing in your support of the Freudian explanation of the individual character on the basis of the unconscious, that it's a question of people might not know why they want what they want, but they know what they want? And it was an argument against the reductionist idea of explaining the character according to past experience. Is that what was the significance of your opening remarks?
Okay.
I actually sort of, I think, summed up your sort of opening bit, and I just put, so what you're saying is that Freud's own childhood clouded his professional judgment in his analysis because of his childhood. No? Okay.
I don't know what his childhood was like. Maybe he did.
Right, okay.
So I'll throw one in for each to come back up as well then, maybe it's something similar. Because I think sort of Dennis was touching on the fact that I've always worked in the theory that to understand society today, you need to understand how we got to where we are today. So why shouldn't the individual be any different? Why shouldn't, to know where the individual is today, we need to understand their past and their childhood? Just to throw that in. It's great being the chair, I don't have to answer anything.
Well, of course, that's one of the things that connects psychoanalysis with Marxism. That we have to understand where we've come from, in order to understand where we are today. There's a historical process at work there. I absolutely agree with you. But those two domains of activity, psychoanalysis and Marxism, have been split apart more than ever. In the early years, there were very close connections between psychoanalysts and Marxists, and a lot of the psychoanalysts in continental Europe were in some way or another sympathetic to the left. Either they were supporters of the socialist parties, in some case even supporters of the communist parties. And that link between psychoanalysis and Marxism was broken with the rise of fascism, when the psychoanalysts who didn't end up in the concentration camps had to flee and come to Britain or go to the United States or other countries. And when that happened, they had to adapt themselves to their host culture that they were fleeing to, the new culture in the United States, for example, adapt themselves and change psychoanalysis from being something that was a process of critique and understanding, historical process of critique and understanding into something that was adapting people into being good citizens to be part of the culture. That's the central critique that Lacan makes against the American ego psychologists. That's what happened to psychoanalysis. Fortunately, through the Lacanian work, we have a potential retrieval of that radical heritage of psychoanalysis, and a connection between cultural critique and individual critique. How we connect the two is difficult, but it's a very, very important connection. The question about the useful child is a nice one. In Capital, Volume 1, Marx goes into great detail of the ways in which capitalism in Britain is founded on the labour of children. Their nimble little fingers, he says, are the ones that can do the sewing and the weaving and the minute work that's needed in the factories. And he has specific sections of Capital devoted to the labour of women, to the labour of immigrant subjects, mainly from Ireland, and of children. Children are absolutely crucial there. And children are turned from being something that doesn't really exist properly as a category into something that we can constitute it as readily exploitable. And we have to put that at the origin of where we see childhood today as well. I want to come to this question of childhood sexual abuse, because it kind of hovers around in the discussions about psychoanalysis. It looks very much from Geoffrey Masson's work, and for all of the problems with Geoffrey Masson's account, it's very useful. It's a very nice book, his book The Assault on Truth, because it does draw attention to the way in which Freud in the early years did see actual childhood sexual abuse as being the cause of later hysteria. And the development of psychoanalysis as such, as a serious independent discipline, was founded on that moment where Freud realized that you didn't need actual childhood sexual abuse to occur to produce the traumas that we all live with. But there's childhood fantasy that is also very effective in making our childhood into something that is traumatic. And the point is that you don't need a bad childhood to make yourself into a subject of psychoanalysis, into someone who needs psychoanalysis or who could benefit from psychoanalysis. You just need a childhood as such, where you're dependent on others, and you have to live through those years of childhood and dependency and helplessness before you eventually become an adult. And those years of dependency and helplessness, where things are confusing and incomprehensible, are, for many people, extremely traumatic. That being said, I think we do have to take very seriously the fact that childhood sexual abuse is extremely widespread, and there is a danger in treating it as a mere narrative that people use in order to give excuses for their behaviour. It is an endemic problem and symptom of the particular power of adults organised in the nuclear family structure in Western culture that makes childhood sexual abuse so widespread. And I think we need to take it seriously as an actual event, as well as taking seriously the fantasies that people have about it when they go into psychoanalysis.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with it a great deal about the. It is interesting, this question of innocence, which of course isn't a category of psychoanalysis, it's of moral philosophy. When we say innocent child, a guilty parent, we're saying it's a moral category, and it's very different, of course, from Freud's vision of children, which is of kind of it's rampant, it's polymorphously perverse at one point, he says, which has been troubling people ever since, but of appetites, and in that way it's not so massively different from a medieval or Aristotelian worldview, though it is, of appetites, and appetites that over time are moderated, and never entirely, but moderated and become agents, where the id was, let the ego be. And it's an important transition. But the question of innocence is compelling to us, because we're not only psychoanalysts, and I want to say with as much vigour as I can that the invention of childhood is a marvellous thing. That the differentiation of childhood and adulthood, I won't say absolute, it's a relationship, of course, is a human achievement. It's a human achievement of tremendous force and power, and not to be sneered at in any way, because it makes the possibility of development, it makes the possibility of within all the problems and limitations and disasters of that nightmare which is the nuclear family, there is space, there's possibility, there's a contained route, so that people are not exposed immediately to the dulling compulsion of the market, and the great problems with the acts that demarcated children as a special category, not least for what they did to women in excluding them from work as well. But nonetheless, it is a great and a marvellous thing, and I don't think we should go back on it. I want to say the division is worthwhile, and it's productive and creative. And there is this thing, and I take seriously what Ian says about sexualization, because this is the Freud story, is that it's not that he doesn't say that, or he corrects himself, he doesn't say that sexual abuse is ubiquitous. He says the incest taboo is ubiquitous because it is a foundation of human civilization. The incest taboo, which means that, of course, there is a degree in which the family is already an eroticized thing, because the taboo, don't sleep with the kids, a good taboo, I want to hang on to that, already puts the thought in your mind, it means that it's eroticized relationship, and it's a condition in which children grow up in, and it is a part of the mechanism. So when now this is very difficult to resolve this question of how does society and politics over here interact with character formation over here. I think it's great, I agree with you, they're fabulous and exciting and thrilling. All the different interactions that took place, the optimism that Trotsky came to psychoanalysis with, which I don't think he understood very well, but his sheer joy at the idea that it might be possible that science will penetrate the realm of the family and the personae, those things, all of that. But I want to say too that there's a big stretch of a difference. I no doubt the two are interacting all the time, but to look at one, you must look at one, and to look at the other, you must look at the other. I feel confident strongly that political, social movements in our time militate against I don't know how to say it, adulthood or personal responsibility. And this is complicated, I know, because you're actually saying something slightly different from me here. And I understand it. I think that it's the ideology of our age says you are responsible. You must collect for your pension in a way that that would have been previously deducted. Constantly telling us how responsible we are. Blah blah blah. The neoliberal. But I listen to the qualifier. Why is it neoliberal? What's wrong with liberal? The neoliberal is it's a formula, it's somebody barking at you through a tin horn. You will be free, you will decide for yourself, do it. And it's the very opposite of people as individuals or communities resolving problems for themselves. It's not really self-authorship, it's a kind of bleating you will, and the trammels are very narrow, aren't they? When you know, what must I do? Must I save? Well, I don't know. Where is the interest rate at the moment? What must I do to be free? So the neoliberal discourse isn't really one that honours authority over, but just control people's authorship of their own lives. So I'd say, in my lifetime, it's been much more associated with the socialist side of the world. The communal self-organisation. That's much closer to me to the idea of adulthood, of taking responsibility for your life. This is diminished. What it does here, I'm not sure. The adulthood here has been knocked down. I imagine, I see some evidence, it's very hard to put it together. In my life, I see a more confused picture, that's all really. The boundaries of, and the boundaries were never absolute, but emerging. The useful child, when I listen to friends who are divorcing, the main use of their children seems to be as their own emotional self-expression. At least that's what they say. I'm sure it's not true, because usually you spend a lot of time making peanut butter sandwiches, in my experience anyway, and it's not very emotionally fulfilling. But we think that children should be important for our emotional fulfilment, and this is what people argue about in courts and why modern-day divorces are so important. So there are many, many different things happening within the realm of character formation and family life and personal life, which I suspect are being impacted upon by the world out there, but it might just as well be the case that the interaction's going the other way and changes that are happening in the individual world are impacting upon political, social life. I just argued with your interpretation of Marx. But I won't actually, I'll do it afterwards.
Oh dear. I'm regretting this.
The anatomy of man is a key to the anatomy of the ape, says Marx. It's not by understanding the past that we understand the present. It's by understanding the present in its more developed forms reveals the less developed.
That's what I meant. So we'll go back out to the audience. Any points, questions?
I'd like to say something to this. The gentleman at the back mentioned his memory of childhood being very free, and most of us of a certain age will agree with that. The idea you went out in the morning to play, and you were called back for tea at tea time, 5 o'clock. So you'd be out all day doing whatever you did, on your bicycle, playing cowboys, blah. So no adults around to be telling you what to do, asking you what you're doing from the mobile point of view, supervising your trip to school and back. The freedom was terrific, and I'm wondering and have been concerned what effect it must have on children as they're growing up to have had an upbringing of constant adult interference and supervision. And I do find it quite worrying. I'm not sure what the implications are. You gentlemen must, or maybe, have seen the result of this kind of thing already coming through. I don't know anything about that. All I know is my own experience, my concern that children will never have the freedom we had. And it was wonderful. And I think it gives you a certain, maybe this is pushing it a bit, independence of thought and action, and appreciation of freedom, that they have never experienced. I find that really sad.
Today's children have less unsupervised play than previous generations.
Yes.
Anyone else?
I'm just wondering.
No, you.
Yeah. I'm just wondering what effect, what influence your own work on psychoanalysis might have had on your own approach to parenthood.
Good question. And was someone here? Dennis?
Yeah, just a quick point. One of the things that seems to be sort of moving about all the time in every aspect is survival. I survived an abusive relationship, I survived this and I survived that. one of the popular things is that you have a survived childhood, or you survived childhood, you were told you survived childhood, as if childhood is some minefield. And what we created out of this survival thing is the idea that we can apply it to all aspects of life. And what we created out of it is the sort of, if you like, omnipresent, ubiquitous idea that we are all victims of something, but we survived some traumatic experience. Not that we found trauma in it, but that we're told it was traumatic.
Okay, I can recommend a good book on the rise of the survivor identity if anyone wants to click on my profile. Someone here? Hannah?
Me and my generation of parents, I get really concerned about the degree to which people prioritise their relationship with their children over their relationship with their partners. And there was a book just recently published which has this theme apparently written by a marriage guidance counsellor who has got a lot of flack from people saying, well, of course your primary responsibility is to your children and not to your partner. But it seems to me that you're talking sense and drawing attention to what's happening in families. My children are just kind of given just kind of unconditional appreciation all the time.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sort of taking that one step further. I was just wondering, certainly if we take the 60s onwards, this introduction of leisure time we have, I think certainly in the Western world we have a lot more time on our hands. If I look back to my mother, who was bringing up 4 children, with a mangle and fires that had to be lit. There was no central heating and no car. We didn't have a car, so you had to walk everywhere. So the actual amount of time she had to give her leisure, attention, either physically or mentally, to her children, and my father as well, was a lot less. And I think that in itself, that even though I know some people are saying they're working 2 jobs or whatever, I think on the whole people have time on their hands, and what are they doing with the time on their hands? How much are they being influenced with what the media is telling us to think about their children or whatever, or wanting to live through their children because they've got all this time on their hands, and therefore they'll spend more time thinking and worrying about what should be doing with their children. So curious to ask about that.
4 points that, to be honest, seem fairly valid to me. Any comments on that?
Yes, all very good points. Very interesting. But when you're talking about childhood as being something that used to be free, I'm a little bit skeptical about that, actually. I didn't think that I'd be sitting here tonight talking about my childhood, but my memory of my childhood was not that it was wonderful and free. Yes, there was some freedom to it. Yes, I was able to walk to school 4 miles. No, I'm exaggerating. I was able to walk to school and back, and then later to go to school, which was over 4 miles away, to secondary school on my own. That will be difficult today, becoming more and more difficult, but that childhood was also a time when I was at the mercy of bullies and the chaos in the playground and all of the petty rivalries and nightmarish aspects of school. I think it's very easy to look back on this childhood as something that has been lost, and it's part of a romanticising of another space away from this world that we live in now, that I think is very seductive and very very tempting to fall into. And I suppose it connects with the question that Tony raised about adultifying our experience and reframing our experience in such a way that we find it difficult to grasp what it was actually like, but we reconfigure it according to the way that we understand what it is to be an adult today. Although I have to say, personally, I find it very difficult to understand what it means to be an adult today. Most of the time, I do feel very childish. Oh, sorry, that fits with the theme which was set up for tonight, so I shouldn't say that either. I want to return to very, very briefly to the question of Jung, which was floated earlier. And I said that Jung wasn't psychoanalytic, and there are a number of reasons why Jung is not psychoanalytic. First of all, Jung believes in a potential free self, a self that becomes what he calls individuated and emerges through the process of analysis, which psychoanalysis doesn't believe in. We don't believe that there is a true, real self that emerges, that has been hidden in the background and that has to be released. Jung has an idea of cultural archetypes. The Jungian analyst becomes an expert in Greek mythology and anthropology and is then able to interpret what the real meaning, the underlying meaning is of these dreams that you bring to analysis. Psychoanalysis doesn't buy that. The meaning of a dream is the meaning of the dream for the patient in analysis, not for the analyst. The analyst doesn't understand what they means, but gives space for the patient to be able to explore the meanings for themselves. And Jung believes that you can heal the division between the unconscious and consciousness, bring the two together. Psychoanalysis says that we are always split, always divided as subjects, divided in our unconscious and divided between consciousness and the unconscious. And finally, Jung does play this line that we reconfigure the past, that we reconfigure our past from the standpoint of the present, so that we can completely remake ourselves. Now, psychoanalysis, for all of its talk about Nachträglichkeit and deferred action, and the ways in which we rework the past within the frame of the present, always takes seriously those primary traumatic, incomprehensible moments, either in fantasy or in what was actually done to us, as things which we have to deal with as adults. It doesn't try and pretend they can be wiped away. In that sense, psychoanalysis is a genuinely historical account of the human subject, not a relativist, postmodern dissolving of the narratives into the stories that we can tell ourselves at the moment, but a genuine historical account. In that sense, the discourse of psychoanalysis is compatible with the discourse of Marxism.
James, first childhood one about our memories, nostalgia's not what it used to be.
No, I'm shared with Ian the view. I mean, it was compelling, the nostalgic. This isn't a put down, because I've heard a very, very similar story. My aunt will tell exactly the same story of her childhood, as I've heard twice tonight about, you talked about it, and a guy at the back talked about it, and it came to me very strongly. And she grew up in the countryside, so that's a slightly different world anyway. And she said they were locked out until it was dark. And they were, if they came back, they were told off, and loved it. She says, and it's and somebody said, and there weren't any adults there, which can't be true. There must have been adults there, and I think I look at my own children. I see that in their lives, in a long, there's great passages of it where we're not there. I mean, to say that they're thrilled and moved and angry about their relationships with their peers, which are all consuming, whereas we are kind of a boring buzz in the background, which is somewhat irritating, and we don't understand that. We put meals on the table and tell them when bedtime is. To them, it's all kind of noise. So it would be interesting to know just how much of the memory is real. Or not that it's not real, just that whether your parents would give the same account, I suppose. I take very seriously this. I do think there are things happening in contemporary culture which are militate against happiness, and part of them is it's uncomfortable to see people over-wedded to their children, and that's a weird thing to say in a way, because my parents were indifferent, wildly indifferent, very exciting lives they lived, and did mad things, and left us alone in the house because they had other things to do. It's interesting, the question of time, and sociologists do go back and forth on this. It's very hard to work out whether we have more or less time, because Jonathan Gershuni did this, where he said, actually we work less hours, each worker works less hours. He said, but look at the calls upon your time. Look at all the devices that soaking your time up. You see that the parents with the kids like this, they're obviously not really in the same space. All of these, I don't want to pose it in a pessimistic, optimistic, lost world, successful world. These are problems we have to deal with now. And some of them are technical, no screen day in our house, not easy to enforce, but very works. I sound like Tory now. They're practical problems to deal with. Some of them, I think, are socio-political or some cultural things that are trends which are problematic, and you see it, for example, in the way that parents are incapable of being told by teachers that their children have behaved badly, and argue with them and fight. I said this to my American students. I have these American students that the National Union of Teachers had cause to complain about the number of assaults, and they said assaults by children, and they said no, assaults. But I was reading the NUT press release, but of parents upon teachers. My American students are hokey by comparison to us sophisticated English people, were transfixed with horror, the very idea that somebody would lift a hand to a teacher. But that's it, and it does happen. I don't say it happens a lot. The National Union of Teachers are bound to make an issue out of it. They're teachers, after all. But it is a shocking thing that happens when the parent comes to the school with the attitude that the insult to my child is an insult to me. I will defend my child against all, and finds it difficult to recognise the authority, this is the word, authority of the school within that relationship. It's not always good, the authority of the school. However, the inability to recognise it, that's a sign of a confusion, of a somewhat childish, am I allowed to say that? A somewhat childish reaction on the part of the parents. An overemphasis of the adult-like character of their children, that they would imagine that must come like lawyers to defend their rights, and a general confusion around the area of the things that the adult world has that are worthwhile in transmitting. And it's really because our adult world isn't very confident on that score. Maybe it shouldn't be, but it doesn't believe itself has got some good account or valuable things to transmit, and for that reason has a very confused attitude.
Okay, we've not got much time, so we'll come out for the last few points. We can make them quite brief, and then we'll come back for the speaker's final comments. So someone, yeah.
I think when I'm referring back to childhood, there's no attempt to turn that into nostalgia. So when I talk about childhood, I talk about it which includes the bullying, the chaos, the violence that we experienced then. But what I remember is the vivacity of living as a child. And I suspect, having heard what's been said tonight, is that somehow the crisis in contemporary society, in modern society, perhaps means that there's a kind of reflux back against childhood in a way to sort of iron that vivacity out, in a way. It's a sort of deadening of things. That's what I've felt.
Thank you. you. At the back.
Recognising that I don't know the difference between psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, Oliver James argues that childhood emotional damage is so endemic that the state should fund 15 hours of psychotherapy for all children before they leave school. So my question is that a good idea or not?
That is a brilliant final question, actually. Oliver James, public nuisance or force for good?
You want a yes or no answer, do you?
Yes, a yes or no answer, no subtleties.
Yeah, yes or no?
No.
The answer is
So
yes
if you
or
want to
no.
respond to any of these and then final comments.
Well, you know, I think Oliver James is very mixed. He does give quite a useful analysis of what he calls affluenza, the idea that people should be searching after commodities and it's through getting more and more goods that they will become happy. Throwing that idea into question isn't a bad thing. It's rehearses again some of the critiques of capitalism that we urgently need. But the idea that we should have, was it 15 hours a week of care by experts funded by the state, it seems to be an absolute nightmare, rather ridiculous. The vivacity of living, I think, is a very nice phrase, and I think it does capture something not only of nostalgia and of romanticising of childhood, but something of what happens to us and the sense of alienation that we feel in this society where everything is so thoroughly commodified, where we're turned into objects ourselves to be bought and sold and have to sell our labour power. We turn ourselves into a commodity as well as wanting more and more commodities. Something there that psychoanalysis can only tackle one by one in the clinic, and you need another kind of collective political practice to tackle that in society. Marxism. We've mentioned it before, but there it is again. The question of undermining responsibility came up earlier, and it's an important issue, and it's a debate inside psychoanalysis as well. There are tendencies inside psychoanalysis which argue, very powerful tendencies, including in Lacanian psychoanalysis, I have to say, which argue that the aim of psychoanalysis is to enable people to become responsible for their actions. But most of us, as analysts, understand that responsibility in the sense of giving response and giving account of our actions to others, not of isolated, individual, neoliberal, we might say, hyper-individualism, but of something in which we recognise our relations to others and have to account for what we have done to others, because that's what it is to be a human being. That's what makes the practice of psychoanalysis possible, after all, that we account to someone else for who we are and hear ourselves give account. And in that way, we become responsible.
Thank you. James?
I did meet Oliver James, who struck me as a little bit crabby, but like Ian, I don't want to commit myself too hard. I wonder about, why would you finance the 15 hours? Don't we have schools? I mean, there's such a kind of surfeit of analysts and therapists that we could replace the teachers. My daughter, who's only 10, can I say, complains bitterly about circle time. She says to me, if that teacher asks me again how I'm feeling, I'm going to scream, she says. And she thinks, I can't say she speaks for a class, but she thinks it's creepy. But it's obviously innocent. The teachers are interested in therapeutic models, and they might be right, they might be wrong. But all I know is that my daughter has an ear that can hear the weirdness of it. My friend on the camera that asked a good question about, why insist on the unconscious, on this apparently rather grandiose theoretical framework. And I don't know if you need to insist on every part of what Freud had to say, but there is something very important, it strikes me, is that we are not conscious rational beings. We are not only conscious rational beings. We are not like the Laputans hovering above the world in an absolutely rational way, with all the answers that can, through mathematics, can resolve the world's problems. We are, our souls, by whatever magic, have been stapled onto animals, and there is this interaction, and it strikes me as an important thing, and very hard to understand what freedom would mean if we weren't, if our conscious choices, the end result, we hope, didn't spring from places that were less than deliberate or conscious. What would the process be if the light just came on and we knew what the answer was? Life would be absurdly easy, if not to say frighteningly, without. There must be a mediation between that world that isn't under our control, that isn't susceptible immediately to rational organisation, and I think this is valuable. This is valuable in Freud, and it must be insisted upon, because it is the defining step, a way to allow us to look at the psyche, and I think it's great. And also, I'm happy about it as a moral Freudian, or Freud supporter. I'm also happy about it as a moral philosopher, because I think it's key to understanding what it is to make decisions, to enact choices. That reason is not the king and lord of us all. And it develops and grows. That it's that we make mistakes, and we have to be allowed to make mistakes. That freedom won't happen if people can't make the wrong choice. If people are not allowed to make the wrong choices, how could they ever make the right choices? And this, it's not surprising to me that childhood, adulthood is an axis on which we feel a bit confused, because it all resolves around that thing that this is what childhood is the that maturation that makes it possible to make the step from bad choices which don't have too much terrible consequence, from motives that you don't entirely understand, to something like a degree of responsibility for your life, which of course never annihilates, the unbidden and the eccentric, as we know. In the supermarket, your hand hovers over the insane item that you do not need, or perhaps the click, or in the relationship that you can't resist messing up. We know that there are many ways that we do stupid things, but knowing that, I think, is what makes it possible to think of the possibility that there can be a transition, that where there was an it, there might be an I.
And one more thing, is that I was puzzled when this was set up, and I knew that you were going to be here, James. Having read your book, The Death of the Subject Explained, I was puzzled about what the conflict would be, and in what way we would be set in opposition to each other, and it turns out that we haven't at all. We're saying the same kind of things about a problem which we've all got to grapple with. Just something that you mentioned in your introduction, you mentioned R.D. Laing and his critique of mainstream forms of treatment. I think one of the things that's interesting about R.D. Laing is that R.D. Laing was developing a critique of the medical model, of medical psychiatry. R.D. Laing was trained as a psychoanalyst. And it was his training as a psychoanalyst that alerted him to the fact that human beings are more than chemical processes, and there's a process of puzzling about who we are, an existential aspect to the question that we need to grapple, and that's why R.D. Laing became such an important influence in the development of the anti-psychiatry and democratic psychiatry movement in Britain, which has expression today in the magazine Asylum magazine, Democratic for Psychiatry. I have copies of the latest issue here. You're welcome to come and buy one, and please take a leaflet and take out a subscription. Thanks very much.
I had made a note to mention that, to give you a plug. Could you give a thank you to, I think, two fantastic speakers.